What if the world's second largest country suddenly vanished from the map, not through war or collapse, but by choice? In 2025, that question no longer sounds impossible. Across Western Canada, provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan are openly debating what was once unthinkable, leaving Ottawa's federation and joining the United States. It's a scenario that would rewrite global borders, shift energy power, and test the meaning of national identity itself. Because Western Canada has reached a breaking point. In 2025, Alberta and Saskatchewan are no longer whispering about separation. They're speaking out loud. What started as frustration over federal policies has turned into an organized political movement that Ottawa can't ignore. Alberta's new Bill 54, passed earlier this year, officially lowers the threshold for citizen-led referendums, opening the legal door for a sovereignty vote. That one change electrified the West. Within months, more than 600,000 Albertans signed petitions led by groups like the Alberta Prosperity Project, Wexit Alberta, and the Western Independence Party. For many, it isn't about leaving Canada out of anger, it's about feeling excluded from a federation that no longer listens. Polls show that between 50 and 55% of Albertans now want to at least explore independence or a new constitutional deal. Ottawa's silence and Mark Carney's continued push for carbon caps and federal control has only widened the divide. Media outlets across the country now call it what it is: Canada's unity crisis. For Alberta and Saskatchewan, the logic of looking south instead of east isn't just emotional, it's economic. Over 85% of Alberta's oil and gas already flows to the United States. The pipelines, refineries, and grids are built north-south, not east-west. Their industries live and breathe American prices and infrastructure. In every practical sense, the economy of the prairies is already tied to the US market. The cultural connection runs just as deep. Gun rights, private enterprise, low taxation, and small government attitudes align closely with the Midwestern and mountain states. In contrast, Ottawa's approach feels bureaucratic and restrictive. Alberta's anger peaked after years of federal climate policies, the tanker ban, and the so-called No More Pipelines Act. Every new rule made it harder to export oil, even as global demand climbed. Saskatchewan, meanwhile, sees a similar problem in agriculture. Its grain and potash depend on US buyers. Farmers watch rail lines heading south and wonder why federal rules keep tying them to an eastern economy that barely understands them. Still, breaking away from Canada isn't as simple as holding a vote and raising a new flag. The law makes sure of that. The Clarity Act of 2000 requires any province seeking separation to hold a clear majority referendum, followed by negotiations with Ottawa and every other province. The 1998 Supreme Court ruling in the Quebec secession reference settled one point forever: no province can unilaterally leave Canada. Even if Alberta's voters said yes, it would take years of talks, legal revisions, and political deals to make it real. And that's only half the story. Joining the United States would mean bilateral treaties, a full constitutional process, and approval from the US Congress under Article 4, Section 3 of the American Constitution. Each step would be historic, contested, and slow. Then there's another layer few discuss publicly: Indigenous treaties. Every inch of Alberta and Saskatchewan includes lands protected under Section 35 of Canada's Constitution. Those treaties are federal responsibilities, meaning no province can override them. For that reason alone, even legal scholars who sympathize with independence admit the path is tangled and steep. But the West's drive isn't only political, it's deeply financial. Alberta has carried the weight of Canada's finances for decades. Each year, it contributes roughly $20 billion more in federal revenue than it gets back. That money flows east through equalization payments, subsidizing programs in other provinces, while Alberta's own projects face cuts. It's a story that feels unfair to many Albertans: pay more, receive less, and get blamed for producing oil. Saskatchewan feels the same about agriculture. Ottawa's quota systems and export restrictions limit what farmers can sell, while the US market next door offers open demand and higher prices. Joining the US, or at least aligning economically, looks less like rebellion and more like self-preservation. Advocates argue that integration would bring lower corporate taxes, direct access to American investors, and guaranteed energy export protection under U.S. law. Critics push back, warning that statehood or union would erase Canada's universal health care, import American-style inequality, and expose citizens to new federal taxes. Supporters respond that Alberta and Saskatchewan could afford private coverage and better infrastructure with the wealth unlocked from unrestricted trade. This is the point where the debate stops being theoretical and starts being personal. For a growing number of Western Canadians, staying inside the existing system feels like losing money, time, and autonomy. Ottawa keeps tightening regulations, the West keeps paying the bill. Whether Alberta's referendum happens this year or next, the idea of joining the United States is no longer a fringe fantasy. It's a reflection of a regional belief that the country has stopped working for them. From Washington's perspective, Alberta's unrest is not just a Canadian domestic issue. It's a potential geopolitical windfall. The United States already depends on Canada for over 60% of its imported crude oil, according to 2024 data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration. Alberta alone accounts for more than 3 million barrels per day of that flow, most of it through the Enbridge Mainline and the Keystone system. For decades, that dependency has been stable but vulnerable. Ottawa's environmental caps, tanker restrictions, and carbon taxes often complicate cross-border energy planning. If Alberta were to join the United States or operate under U.S. law, those uncertainties would vanish overnight. Washington would gain secure, long-term control over the world's third-largest proven oil reserves, roughly 170 billion barrels locked in Alberta's sands, without relying on imports from the Middle East or Venezuela. The attraction doesn't end with oil. Control of Canada's Arctic routes and critical mineral zones has become an urgent matter for the Pentagon. In 2025, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin emphasized that rare earth independence was now as important as energy independence after China restricted graphite exports in late 2024. Canada holds vast untapped deposits of lithium, nickel, and cobalt across the Northwest Territories and northern Saskatchewan. Under American jurisdiction, these resources would directly feed the Defense Production Act framework, bypassing Chinese supply chains. Strategically, it would also tighten U.S. influence over the Arctic Council, a forum where Russia has expanded its presence since sanctions in 2022. For Washington, adding Alberta and possibly Saskatchewan would close the continental defense gap that NORAD currently shares with Ottawa, turning a binational command into a purely domestic operation. But economic ambition collides with political calculation. If Alberta and Saskatchewan became states, they would add roughly 7 million people to the U.S. population, about the size of Washington state. Based on current voting patterns, analysts at the Brookings Institution estimate that these regions would lean strongly conservative, potentially granting Republicans 4 new Senate seats and 10 to 12 seats in the House of Representatives. That possibility makes statehood a partisan minefield. Democrats would resist for electoral reasons, while Republicans would champion it for the same. The divide inside Congress would be immediate. Adding new states also triggers constitutional and administrative hurdles. State constitutions, judicial systems, taxation harmonization, and incorporation of provincial laws under federal oversight. Even with political will, such a process would take years. Within Canada, the reaction to Alberta's separatist momentum has been fierce and divided. Ontario and Quebec, which dominate federal fiscal transfers, frame the movement as economic blackmail. In April 2025, Ontario Finance Minister Peter Bethlen-Falvey called Alberta's demands for U.S. alignment a dangerous stunt aimed at destabilizing national unity. Quebec Premier François Legault described it as a constitutional bluff, while quietly lobbying Ottawa to protect equalization mechanisms that favor eastern provinces. The federal government under Mark Carney's leadership has dismissed the concept of U.S. integration as an unconstitutional fantasy. Yet behind closed doors, Ottawa has rolled out subtle fiscal measures, debt relief, infrastructure incentives, and energy tax credits to calm rising anger in the prairies. Canada's media ecosystem mirrors the division. The National Post and Western Standard frame Alberta's push as a legitimate constitutional debate, while outlets like the Toronto Star call it economic treason. Talk radio and podcasts across Western Canada feature nightly discussions on whether Ottawa can legally prevent a referendum. Even within British Columbia, the fault line is visible. The resource-heavy interior sympathizes with Alberta's grievances, while Vancouver and coastal communities reject the idea outright, citing environmental risks and U.S. trade tensions. Indigenous leaders add another layer of complexity. In March 2025, the Assembly of First Nations released a statement warning both governments that any sovereignty shift would violate binding treaty relationships that predate Confederation. That warning carries legal weight. Courts have consistently held that treaty lands cannot be transferred without Indigenous consent. The global implications of even a partial secession would be immediate. Financial analysts at RBC Capital Markets warned in February 2025 that a single provincial referendum could trigger Canadian dollar volatility exceeding the 2015 oil crash. Global investors view Alberta's oil sands as security-backed assets. Any uncertainty in jurisdiction could lead to sudden divestment. Oil prices would likely surge as traders anticipate export disruptions, while Ottawa's bond markets would suffer capital flight. On the U.S. side, Washington would face diplomatic backlash. The move could be seen as economic annexation, straining the U.S.-Canada-Mexico Agreement (USMCA) ratified in 2020. The Arctic Council, where both countries sit as members, would fracture over territorial boundaries and environmental jurisdiction. Rival powers would not stay silent. Russia, already seeking Arctic shipping dominance, would portray the breakup as evidence that Western alliances are weakening. State media outlets like RT and Sputnik have historically amplified separatist debates in NATO countries, and analysts expect the same playbook here. China would seize the opportunity to argue that North American instability proves the unsustainability of Western democracy, while accelerating its own mineral partnerships with remaining Canadian provinces. NATO itself would face an operational dilemma. The alliance's defensive architecture is built around Canada's membership. If part of Canadian territory became U.S. soil, command structures, funding quotas, and logistics in the High North would all need revision. Trade partners in Europe and Asia would also react swiftly. The European Union, heavily reliant on Canadian grain and energy imports, would need to renegotiate terms if those exports fell under U.S. tariffs or Buy American provisions. Japan, which signed a 2024 energy supply agreement with Alberta, would be forced to shift contracts under U.S. jurisdiction. Such adjustments could disrupt global supply chains and undermine years of bilateral diplomacy. The outcome would not resemble a conquest, but a gravitational pull. Trade patterns, pipelines, currencies, and defense frameworks already orbit Washington more than Ottawa. In this scenario, Alberta's shift would merely formalize an economic reality decades in the making, one that redraws maps not through war, but through the silent force of economics and exhaustion.